Wrestle-F. Definition: a fighter who has no chance trading punches with his opponent and keeps the fight on the ground, just laying on the other, changing positions sometimes, and throw 2 punches per minute. Also known as lay and pray. This eloquent definition was provided by Urban Dictionary user MMA Fighter back in January 2011, and whilst it's both a little mean-spirited and a grammatical mess, it does well to distill the level of disdain the casual fan has for one of mixed martial arts' most divisive game plans. Wrestle-fucking involves taking down your opponent and prioritizing control time, rather than damage, positional advancement, or submissions. Ultimately, the goal of this strategy is to stay in positions like full guard or half guard, on top, and to keep your opponent on their back as much as possible. The mathematics of mixed martial arts favour this approach heavily. In most of the world's major MMA organisations, bouts are scored within the parameters of the 10-point must system. The winner of the round receives 10 points, the loser of the round receives 9 or less. Your goal is, loosely, to win a majority of the rounds within this scoring system. In most cases, that just means that you need to be scored the winner of 2 out of 3 rounds. Now, each round is 5 minutes long. Again, realistically, you only need to win a slight majority of a round to secure that frame. As such, hypothetically, if you control things decisively for 3 of the 5 minutes, you're probably going to win that round, unless something significant happens in the other 2 minutes, like you get dropped or your opponent nearly wraps up a submission. All this is to say that to win a 15-minute fight, you only really need 6 minutes of decisive, inarguable control. As long as you don't get blown out in the one remaining round and lose it 10-8, you should win on the scorecards. This is why wrestlers have been so historically successful in the sport. There is no better way to secure decisive control time than by getting someone to the ground and sitting on top of them. On the feet, a judge might fail to register the significance of a specific strike. With wrestling, you don't really have that same issue. It's usually pretty obvious who is winning the exchange. On that, judges instinctively reward this kind of activity because it makes their job easier. Put yourself in their shoes. When you get to the end of a round, you don't think back on the past 5 minutes and evaluate each individual strike, clinching sequence, takedown, and positional alteration. There are too many details to pass through, and you've got to deliver a score in a very short amount of time. As a result, you're probably going to end up isolating a few key, noteworthy moments and extrapolating from those to determine who you believe won the round. Within this framework, wrestlers make a judge's job straightforward. If they hold down their opponent successfully for a few minutes at a time, a judge can look at that as the most clear-cut, decisive segment of the round and justify scoring the round in favour of that fighter. Even though the unified rules were changed to more heavily reward damage back around 2016, if you give a judge the chance to make a defensively lazy scoring decision, they will most likely take it. A great example of this style working in modern mixed martial arts is Muhammad Mokaev. He's a young, well-touted prospect who looks for top control above all else. In his fight with Charles Johnson, he landed the same amount of significant strikes as Johnson, despite completing 12 takedowns and recording 11 minutes and 44 seconds of control time. And even though he's got some finishes on his record, they've usually occurred later in the fight, when his opponent is either tired or desperate. Watch his fights with Tim Elliott or Jafel Filio for examples. With all this being said, it's worth acknowledging that those who engage in the Wrestle-F indulge in a strategy that has the capacity to take as much as it can give. Enter our main case study, Jon Fitch.
I don't like decisions. I want to finish the fight, so I work to finish the fight.
This was said by Jon Fitch in the video package for his UFC debut. At the time, a cursory look down Fitch's record could confirm his assertion. He didn't seem to like decisions. He was 11-2 with 1 no contest, and of those 11 victories, 5 were KOs or TKOs, and 2 were submissions. A 71% finish rate from your first 14 bouts suggests you're pretty damn exciting. Alas, that wasn't really the case. Let's take a closer look at one of these finishes. His fight with veteran Shoni Carter looks compelling on paper, it being a submission in the 3rd round against a generally compelling opponent. In actuality, most of the bout was just Fitch stagnating in either half guard because of Carter's use of the Kimura trap, or mount. The finish came off of a fairly standard lat drop that Carter tapped to. But all that doesn't matter, because the record, as well as his affiliation with well-favoured Jim aka, meant that Fitch got the green light from the upper brass and made his way to the big show. It didn't take the top dogs very long to realise that whilst Fitch was obviously very good, he didn't have the most casual friendly style under the sun. Training under Bob Cook and BJJ black belt Dave Camarillo, Fitch was one of the early adopters of cage wrestling and would often push guys towards the fence, even when he took them down in the middle of the octagon. But this style wasn't always the most beloved or well understood. See here, when referee Steve Mazzagatti breaks up a cage exchange between Fitch and Josh Berkman just a minute into their fight. It's glaringly apparent that whilst Fitch's style was conducive to winning individual fights, it wasn't ideal for getting title shots. Fitch competed in his first and only UFC welterweight championship fight at UFC 87 against George St-Pierre. The only other competitor who had fought more UFC fights prior to their first welterweight title shot was Matt Serra, and he had gone 5-4 in his UFC career to that point, excluding Ultimate Fighter exhibitions. To be forced to win 8 consecutive UFC fights before receiving your first title shot back in 2008, that was unprecedented. For what it's worth, GSP and Fitch had a fairly entertaining, if not lopsided, 5-round fight. GSP won unanimously with 50-43, 50-44 and 50-44 scorecards, but Fitch fought valiantly despite some major adversity. He was dropped halfway through the first round with his right hand, and even still was able to prevent St-Pierre from passing his guard, thanks to his thoughtful chaining together of open guard, Z guard and butterfly guard. It wasn't until GSP had cracked Fitch later on in the first that he was able to briefly get past Fitch's guard, securing the turtle for a few seconds before Fitch Granby rolled into side control, and then half guard, and then back to close guard. Most impressively, Fitch was able to get some control time on GSP towards the beginning of the third round. Fitch escaped St-Pierre's back control and then put in a decent segment of work from the top, before St-Pierre was able to come out the back door using deep half guard. 1 minute and 52 seconds represented the second most control time GSP had conceded in a UFC fight to that point. Even still, Fitch got absolutely and undeniably schooled. He couldn't deal with the jab, he couldn't deal with the naked straight right, he couldn't get much offense going from his back, and he got beat up from the front headlock position. But still, given he had an 8-fight UFC win streak going into that contest, you'd think it'd only take a couple of consecutive wins for Fitch to get a second go at the belt. You would be wrong. Back-to-back decision wins against Akihiro Gono, Paulo Thiago, Mike Pierce, Ben Saunders, and former title challenger Thiago Alves only did well to net him a #1 contenders fight against former champion BJ Penn. And whilst Fitch beat the brakes off of Penn in the third round, it was only good enough for a majority draw. After that, Fitch got blasted with a left hook 12 seconds in against Johnny Hendricks, and all of a sudden, the road back to title contention seemed unimaginably long. 2 fights later, Fitch lost a decision to Damian Maia and was subsequently cut from the organisation. Jon Fitch got Fitched by Maia, and it meant that despite a 14-3-1 record in the company, with 2 of those 3 losses coming to current or future champions, the UFC deemed him undesirable for their roster. Within this story, there's a message to be heeded. What we've termed wrestle-fucking is, at its core, flawed, and that's due to the nature of MMA itself. In other sports, your personal ability to draw crowds and produce large pay-per-view figures should not, and often do not, determine the way you approach the sport. In mixed martial arts, the monopolistic and monopsonistic composition of the industry mean that sometimes the methodology that's best for your health and for guaranteeing wins isn't always the preferable strategy. Look at Michael Chandler. He was a 4-time NCAA Division I qualifier who, despite his power, often leaned on his wrestling to win fights in Bellator, like versus Brent Primus and Benson Henderson. In the UFC, you haven't seen too much of that. We've seen a lot more shifting right hooks than we have double legs from Chandler, ever since he entered the UFC in 2021. When Fitch was cut, Dana White went on record to justify why Fitch was let go and said this.
But I can tell you this, Jon Fitch isn't cheap.
In his last fight with the company, Jon Fitch earned $66,000 to show. A former title challenger who had won the vast majority of his fights, had beaten quality competition, and generally only fought 2 times a year. it was considered too expensive to pay that man $66,000 to show. Therein lies the risk of the WrestleFuck. It can be great to win a singular fight with, particularly if you're already on a decent contract or you have a built-in audience who will watch you regardless. But otherwise, if this is the approach you're going to adopt, you best win all your fights, or you might just find yourself scrounging around looking for a deal with one of the smaller MMA organizations out there.